Dirk Chatelain joins the show to discuss his views on Nebraska and the state of college sports. That's next.
You are Locked On Nebraska, your daily Nebraska Cornhuskers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On Nebraska your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use Locked On College for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply.
All right, good morning. As you can see, if you're watching along with us on YouTube, we do have another guest. We're going for 4 in a row here. It's Dirk Chatelain, formerly of the Omaha World-Herald. Dirk, how does it feel to be the fourth person we thought of to be a guest on the show?
Well, I just appreciate you guys. I asked multiple times to come on the podcast, and Mitch basically said on a cold day in hell. But what he actually said is, we will have you on years from now when schools actually agree to pay their athletes. He thought it would be decades down the road, and here we are. I'm just the fourth guest.
That turns out that's
right.
Today.
Exactly right.
So yeah, I want to get into that a little bit later. Let's start you off with some Nebraska stuff, Dirk. From the outside looking in, 40,000 foot view, you've been around, Nebraska football for a long time. How does it feel to you right now going into the second year of Matt Rhule, and what do you feel like they're doing? They're doing well at the moment. Feels like they have some momentum, but what's your kind of view on that?
Well, I think it's really interesting, not just at Nebraska but across the country, how you really can put a target on these second seasons of a coaching staff. I mean, it's almost cliche at this point, to the importance of these second years. And Nebraska, frankly, usually has a good one under a coaching staff. I mean, there's usually a little bit of a breakthrough. Scott Frost would be an exception to that, but Frank had a breakthrough, and Bill Callahan had a breakthrough, and Mike Riley did, and Bo had arguably his best team in year 2, and that's a fairly consistent theme across college football too. When a program turns it around, especially a historical powerhouse, often it happens in the second season. So I think there's a lot of anticipation, not just locally because of that, but also regionally and nationally. There's a sense that if it's going to happen, you're going to see some signs this fall. And in addition to that, I think the Dylan Raiola thing was just a huge boost of credibility. Whether he's a standout quarterback this fall or not, I think that was a little bit of a flashing red light, so to speak, for Nebraska football across the country. It's really interesting to watch sort of the national media respond to the Huskers over the last 25, 30 years. I think generally speaking, Nebraska has been mocked, and people have enjoyed sort of the downfall of the Huskers. We may be finally reaching a point where people are rooting for it to rebound, in part because of nostalgia, in part because there's just an understanding and expectation that college football is better when the Huskers are involved. So for all those reasons, I think it's really an exciting season.
So I want to go kind of inside baseball a little bit with you, because you spent the better part of 20 years around the Nebraska program where you were pretty close to it. And now you're certainly around that, much more around the edges, as someone who stepped aside from the daily sports writing stuff. And as you know, it's beneficial to people in our jobs to have a head coach and an administration that is very much willing to work with us, people like us, what we do, and not necessarily have like a standoffish relationship, to be in a situation where reasonable requests are granted, access is outstanding. That kind of stuff has not always existed at Nebraska, depending on the coach. What do you see from the outside about Matt Rhule that sticks out to you in that way? Because he's pretty unique in that area.
Well, I do see interesting stories, interesting content, but even more than that, I see a person who is just extremely polished and savvy when it comes to communications. And it can be something as simple as who he compliments and when. It can be the way that he articulates something in a time of semi-crisis. He's just an extremely good communicator, and I think there's a lot of value to that, especially when you're running an operation the size of a Division I football program. It gives everybody confidence. It gives everybody clarity. You know, again, Nebraska has kind of swung the pendulum back and forth, right, between good media access and bad media access. I remember almost a decade now meeting Mike Riley at his downtown Lincoln hotel and literally walking with him to the stadium in the morning, and he allowed me to do that and have breakfast with him, and it was very strange. And even in hindsight, um, and obviously there's been some coaching staffs who didn't necessarily believe in that. There was more of a bunker mentality with Bo and with Scott, and sort of I think a feeling that our results will communicate for us, will be our expression. And I think Rule is just, whether he wants to be this way always, or whether he's just too damn good at it not to be this way. But he's really kind of, I think, embraced the role. I mean, you guys, he's sorry, he is publicly drawing attention to his wife's business.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
can you imagine Bo Pelini doing that, or Scott Frost doing that? Like, it's in many ways he's a 21st century football coach when it comes to all this, because I think he's sort of recognized that, okay, I can either enjoy this and do it right, or I can probably get out of the job. There's not going to be anything in the middle.
Crisis being, sorry, Connor. Crisis. I want to just follow up quick on that. That was, I assume you're referring to the untimely departure of Trev Alberts and how
Yeah.
Matt Rhule handled that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was an extraordinary moment, right? It was like the athletic director, or the athletic department, essentially had no voice. And nobody, from politics to the university, there was nobody who was really stepping into that void and saying anything to make anybody feel good. And here everybody's looking at the football coach, like, who's been here about 10 minutes, and they're
Right.
like, hey, can you help us out here? And
Also, we don't know if you really want to stay.
he kind of did. He kind of did. So, this, who knows what this looks like 9 months down the road, right? This could look
Yeah.
very, very different if he goes 4-8. If he goes 10-2, and Penn State is calling. I mean, who knows? You just don't know. Everything moves so fast. But at this moment, I think Matt Rhule has been sort of just what Nebraska needed.
If you go back, when he was first hired, and you think about how people react to it, it was, I'm not sure how much has this guy really won at the major level, and he just got fired from Carolina, and it was kind of a disaster. I don't think people were quite sure what to think, and they went 5-7 in their first year. But now you look at, a year and a half after he's hired, he has all this equity with the fan base. How do you think he's indoctrinated himself to the fan base so well to where people do look at him in those situations? Yeah, it's probably in the absence of somebody being there, in the case of Trev leaving. But, like, how do you feel like that's developed over just 18 months here?
Well, I think he's been genuine, and sincerity goes a long way in that job. I think people, when they interact with him, they legitimately feel like he cares about Nebraska, and he's taking the job very seriously, and I think that really matters. An interesting way to look at it, Connor, is what would have happened. They had a relatively disappointing season. They lost some games that were just absolute head scratchers. Can you imagine if they'd gone 8-4 last year? The excitement that that people would have, or 7-5 even.
So unhealthy, I would say.
Yes, unhealthy. I mean, it's been actually somewhat moderated, just by the fact that they were a maddening football team last year. Had they been had
Yeah.
they played really well, we'd be looking at even different levels of local enthusiasm. So I think now, having said all that, I think a lot of people are still taking a wait and see approach, including myself, by the way. There is an element of wake me up when they finally do something. I know a lot of fans who take that approach. So, and in fact, I sort of famously have a friend who told me back in 2019. He said, "I'll start watching when they beat somebody they're not supposed to beat," and I don't think he's watching yet. So,
Yeah.
we'll see. But this is potentially the year when something happens.
Yeah. All right. After the break, we want to talk to Dirk a little bit about Nebraska football being in the news in Omaha recently, in the context of the book that Dirk wrote, 24th and Glory, and just how historically significant the city of Omaha is. So we'll get to that after the break. But right now, please follow us on Twitter at Locked On NEB. Send us an email at lockedonneb@gmail.com. You can find us, if you're not there right now, on YouTube or on any of the podcast listening platforms, Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music. Back with more after this with Dirk Chatelain.
Hey, it's Apper here for the FanDuel Sportsbook. It is getting to be crunch time in the NBA and the NHL. And FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to use on spreads and money lines, player props, and more. Player props are so big in the NBA. We have a game 2 in the Western Conference Finals tonight. Timberwolves are 5.5-point favorites against the Mavs, so people expect them to bounce back. If you place a wager on either side of that game and you win, and you're a new customer, it's $150 in bonus bets. There's also the PGA Tour, MLB, NHL. There's a Caitlin Clark tab. You could use that as well. Head to FanDuel.com/locked on and make every playoff shot count. That is with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook.
All right, back for a second segment of the Locked On Nebraska podcast with award-winning former sports writer extraordinaire Dirk Chatelain. Dirk, hope you're enjoying summer vacation. It's all of one day old. Our kids are in the same school district out here in Gretna. And did you get a wake-up call last night from the blaring of tornado sirens?
I'm disappointed that you didn't lead the show with this. Last night was a complete disaster.
Well, Connor slept through it, so we couldn't.
I didn't get anything on my phone here in Douglas County, so I mean, you got
sirens going off at 2:00 in the morning. Are everybody in the house, being like, it was like a scene from Twister there for a little while, and and thankfully it didn't play out like Twister, but yeah, it was not a very good night's sleep. The dogs were a mess. We might need an extra nap today.
The silver lining is this is the first Friday of summer, officially, unofficially, whatever. And the kids didn't have to get up and go to school today. So
Great point.
that hour and a half awake in the basement last night has not turned this place into a house of horrors yet. So
Not yet.
Hope you get the same treatment out there.
Although yesterday, my daughter, my dear daughter, after her mother took her to the zoo for like 5 hours, she got home and she was home for about a half hour, and she goes, "I'm bored. I'm depressed." It's like at that moment, Mitch, it's like this is going to be a long summer.
Yeah, my soon-to-be 8th grader told me in the afternoon yesterday. He asked me what day it was as we were headed out to Elkhorn for his baseball game last night, and he said, "I've already lost track of the days." I'm like, "Dude, this is the first day of summer vacation."
Well, fortunately, Gretna's opening a big YMCA water park, Connor, and I think you can drop kids off at the age of like 10. So there might be like 3,000 kids at this stinking water park.
Yeah, and my high school age daughter will be watching them for you. So
nice.
You're welcome in advance. Yeah, she's lifeguarding out there.
I hope
I'll be out there.
I hope she's making $80 an hour for that job.
Something like that, yeah. So, all right, we want to discuss a bit for a few minutes here about the city of Omaha, since we're talking about the Omaha suburbs here. For anyone who doesn't know, and you all should know, Dirk, in his time at the Omaha World-Herald, wrote the book 24th and Glory about the athletes from North Omaha. And we're talking about Gale Sayers, Bob Gibson, Bob Boozer, Marlon Briscoe, Johnny Rogers. So just an incredible line of athletes who competed around the time of the civil rights movement, and just their historical significance in sports, locally, regionally, nationally. And it goes so far beyond sports. You know, I think I said, I called it a masterpiece on the city of Omaha and the history of the city of Omaha, and that was at one time in the book jacket of this piece, until I think it was Greg from Twitter who knocked me off with his praise for the book. So thank
No,
you for that.
I think didn't you get bumped for the governor? I think Bob Kerry bumped you. So
Nah, I think it was Greg from Twitter. I'm gonna go with that.
okay,
So,
Uh,
uh,
that's a better story.
yeah. So I wonder, in light of all that, what you think about what seems to be kind of a current uptick in athletic talent among young Omahans. I know you're involved in coaching basketball in Gretna. So there are a lot of young Omahans who don't have the same kind of access to training as their more well-resourced peers who live in the suburbs or other parts of town or other parts of the state of Nebraska. And one thing that Matt Rhule has done with his staff is reach out to places like North and South Omaha, and curious on your perspective about all of that.
Well, I think we have to start with a couple things. One, Bob Devaney won a national championship when he fixed North Omaha recruiting. That's a fact. I mean, Johnny Rogers was the single biggest recruit in that era. I would argue the biggest recruit in Nebraska football history. And 10 years
Wow.
before Johnny Rogers, there was a Johnny Rogers named Gale Sayers who didn't go to Nebraska because Nebraska didn't have its act together with recruiting. Um, for decades after that, Devaney and Tom Osborne placed a high priority on Nebraska, on Omaha recruiting, and not just North Omaha or OPS, but the city in general. I mean, it was a critical piece of Nebraska's success. And then there was a serious dip. And we could argue when and to what degree that dip occurred, but Nebraska there was sort of a divide between the kids in Omaha and the University of Nebraska, and you saw it, with a lot of frustrating cases with kids going other places, partly because the Huskers weren't playing well, partly because there just wasn't a very good system to connect with these kids. And then, it improved a little bit. I mean, Scott Frost had his moments. And I think there's hope that Nebraska still carries enough cachet, to get the best players out of the biggest city in the state. And I would argue that in order to get to where it wants to go, Nebraska has to get the best kids out of the biggest city in the state. And I think, where this kind of goes back to our first segment, where I think Rhule can succeed in part because A, he's extremely organized in a way that not every Nebraska coach has been. And B, he's a really he's a very persuasive individual. And I think he listens to the right people, and he's placed a priority in the right spots. And so when I see a camp, for instance, a free camp in Omaha, led by the Nebraska coaching staff, it's like, wow, that's a heck of a lot. In my opinion, that's a heck of a lot smarter move than 10 years ago, doing satellite camps in Calabasas or wherever. I mean, do this thing in your own backyard. And I'm not saying it has to be one or the other, but I think it's interesting right now how Rhule seems to be kind of one step ahead of the game, when it comes to a lot of different things, and I would place that one near the top of the list. So we'll see if it pays dividends. As you mentioned, Mitch, there clearly is a greater a greater surge of talent in Omaha than there was, at certain times in the past. I think that's in part because, the city has advanced a long ways in terms of training and personal instruction. And,
Yeah. I mean, the Warren
it's,
Academy and
yeah, I mean, there's just we can name a lot of different private businesses and people involved. And, that didn't necessarily exist 20 years ago. So I'm not sure it's been a huge improvement for the average kid, but it has been a huge improvement for the standout athlete. And I think, those are the types of kids that Nebraska needs. If you can get a few of them, just a few of them every year, I think it would really help the program.
How far can they go just in these areas, whether it's recruiting in state, recruiting in general? I mean, we've seen a lot of coaches put this to the test before without, like, eventually you got to win. You're bumping up against the ceiling in some regard. And the recruiting piece will help tell some of the story about the winning. But eventually, you're going to have to get to that point. It's so funny how much we've seen that over the years, Dirk. Like, eventually for Matt Rhule, they're going to have to win some football games. Obviously, they hope it starts this year. But I'm curious about what you think about just the football team and basically their record and its effect on the local kind of recruiting scene.
It's a fantastic question, and it is something that we've been talking about for probably at least 20 years. Does the talent boom come before the signs of success, or do they work in conjunction? Your chicken and egg scenario is really interesting. My sense is that they need to get it going on their own. They need to show signs, and then I think the credibility of the operation becomes something that is very hard to say no to. If you're living within the boundaries of this state and Nebraska figures it out and starts winning, say 9 games or 10 games, then there becomes a lot of local pressure, to become part of it. So I think they kind of have to do it on their own or with the help of Dylan Raiola and, obviously some guys who are going down there from within the boundaries. Carter Nelson's hopefully going to help. But they probably have to do some of that on their own before they fully convince everybody that it's a credible operation. And then, very similar to what Devaney did and what Osborne did and even what Frank did, once that happens, I think it gets a lot easier to win arguments with players.
All right, Dirk Chatelain's with us. We'll come back and we got a final segment with him where we'll talk about something he mentioned right off the top. We are headed into a different era of college athletics, and we'll get to that on the other side. But first, if you are watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and you have to turn down the volume with all the shouting about the Knicks, make sure to make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. That's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, quick minute here to tell you about Gametime, sponsor of the Locked On podcasts. Connor, as we discussed many, many times on this podcast, I did attend a Kansas City Royals game with my family last Sunday, and I'm now using a Kansas City Royals coffee mug commemorating the 2014 American League Championship. So this is to celebrate my trip to Kansas City. I think the Royals are still winning. They may have won last night, even though they didn't play. That's at least my take on it. I'll be back. I'll tell you that. After going to the K this last week, I'm going to be headed back there this summer as soon as I can to see the winning Royals and Bobby Witt do whatever they're doing. And it will be a better experience, I can tell you, from this first experience this year because of Gametime, which is now an authorized ticket marketplace of MLB. It helped me. It'll help you. You get tickets easier and faster. Prices on the app go down as it gets closer to first pitch. You've got all-in pricing without all the fees at checkout, deals for specific zones of the stadium, flexible customer service if you need that. It's all there. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Check it out at gametime.co and download the Gametime app today. Lowest price guaranteed.
All right, Dirk, you mentioned it. College sports just changed overnight. Over the last couple of days, it's been building for a while.
This week.
Yesterday, there was an approval of a settlement agreement by all 5 of the major conferences and the NCAA, and it looks like they're going to be paying athletes at schools. The NIL is going to move in-house, and Nebraska, among many other places around the country, could be and probably will be fitting the bill for about $20 million a year as a payroll for their athletes. I mean, first of all, just to ask you the question based off of that, how unbelievable is this that, I felt like that would come around the time that we had flying cars, and here we are in 2024.
Yeah, I want to see like a response from Cecil Newton or somebody like that. Somebody who took advantage of the old ways and probably had their reputation stained in the process.
What does Eric Dickerson think about this?
Yes. I want to interview a bagman, who was in charge of delivering $50,000 from a head coach secretly to one of his players. It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. I mean, it's just and absolutely hilarious too. I mean, because how long did the universities and the NCAA said, how long did they say never, 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 never? And and here we are, and everybody just throws up their hands like, well, whatever. I feel like that's kind of what it's at right now. So, it's funny because take all your compliance officials who were in charge of basically making sure this never happened and just turn them all into lawyers now, into Title IX lawyers, because now they've got to figure out how to do this, in a way that they don't get sued. So what a fascinating time.
Lawyers and agents. They'll be repping players and helping them come to the best contract, whichever side of the pay for play fence that all of the old compliance people end up coming down on. It is a bizarre world in college sports that we're moving into. And if NIL, well, I think we already knew this, but NIL reinforced the reality that there are unintended consequences of basically any big move that you do in college sports. When you rewrite the recruiting rules, there's unintended consequences. People find loopholes that you never could have imagined as you draw up the legislation. So very early in this process, I mean, we're not there yet where the paychecks are flowing, but what could you see, Dirk, with all of this above board and payrolls and tax implications and everything that's going to happen in college sports? And we'll still have NIL. NIL is still going to be there in something that resembles its current form. It may be the deciding factor because you only get $20 million to pay your players, but NIL and your donors can still exist outside and pay them even more. Well, at least that's the way the settlement looks to be headed. What could you see, in just a minute or two, because we don't have all day and we've got to get out of here, as a potential unintended consequence of all of this?
Well, first of all, let me say this. I think it would be so much easier if it was separated by sport, to where the football programs were the same, and the baseball programs were the same. The way that I read it, a university can allot that $20 million however they want, right? I mean, I know they can't.
Well, it's yet to be determined, but I think that will
Yes.
be the case. Yeah.
But like, you will have schools that say we're going to put 40% of this into men's basketball, and other schools are going to say we're going to put 10 million, 10% of this into men's basketball. So I think that makes it really messy. And obviously that it was kind of that way with NIL too, but this,
Right.
Sort of formalizes that in a way that I think has really interesting consequences. Like, what programs are you actually going to prioritize at your school, and which ones are you not? Are you going to have programs that you just stop funding altogether? I mean, I think that's a very reasonable question.
Right.
They essentially become club sports that you still sponsor, but you don't put any resources into. I think I think the schools, the big schools will still do extremely well. I mean, with almost every change, the big schools do really well. I think what's fascinating about this is what happens to, Kansas football or Purdue football or, Vanderbilt or, these programs that are kind of hanging on the edge. Is this one step closer to that top 32, just saying the heck with these guys? We're not gonna, this isn't socialism. We're not going to solve all their problems anymore, because it sure feels like that's the gravity, right? That's where everybody wants to go. Um, and I think, the Power Five. This is another way for the Power Five to separate from everybody else. I just think we're inching closer and closer toward a world where, um, you're either in the cool kids club in college athletics or you're not. But more specifically, what fascinates me is how schools, allot their resources.
Yeah, and it might be a smaller club than just the 65 who are currently in the Power Five, because some of those 65 might not have 20 mil sitting around every year
Mhm.
to pay their athletes. So hey, we could go on for another hour with you and everything, and we didn't get to Trev Alberts and Nebraska basketball, but we'll have to have you back one more time at least during this off season before Big Ten Media Days to talk about some more of that stuff. But thank you so much, Dirk, for coming on today and sharing your wisdom and your insight with us. We certainly appreciate it.
That sounds great, you guys. Have a good one, and I really appreciate the show. A little more Royals talk would be good, but aside from that, it's a great show.
More Royals and more Colorado. I think it's clear that's what
Sounds
our
good to me.
YouTube listeners want. Yeah. All right. To finish up, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's available on Amazon Fire TV in the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts on Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app.